All right, so here I'm going to try to just explain the confusion I had with my grandpa a little bit more, just to kind of articulate it better. But like in 2023 is when I started to read Dr. Horace books, who was my grandpa's teacher. My grandpa got his PhD in psychology under Dr. Horace. Dr. Horace was the founder of existential metapsychiatry. And Dr. Horace is an existentialist, and he like literally would say, if there's a, I learned this in 2023, if there's a storm, you created the storm. If you're sick, you created it. It's your invalid thoughts. So you take responsibility for everything. That's what existentialists do. They take responsibility for everything. And he really took that to the extreme. Very new age, kind of like the book The Secret, the movie The Secret. But my grandpa would make things more rational. And that's what confused me about my grandpa, because he seemed kind of spiritual but rational at the same time. So, and he didn't teach what Dr. Horace taught, but I only found that out later. And I didn't even understand, because it took me till 2020 to read his Dr. Horace books and to understand, oh, this is why my grandpa's so into taking responsibility, because he's an existentialist. Like, I was just always confused. Like, why are you so into that? But, he thinks it's the best way to be. And, I think he has a lot of points to it. Like, because when I was a Darwinist and when I was anti-religious, yeah, it makes you justify negative actions. But this is the thing, though, is I think it was my grandpa's teachings kind of confused me and made me more of a Darwinist, because I'm like, okay, so he doesn't believe in a separate God. So like, but he says take responsibility for everything. So it seems kind of like it's white supremacist and conservative, like take responsibility for everything, but he doesn't believe in a separate God. And I like that, because I wanted to destroy Christianity, because I saw Christianity as conservative and maintaining the status quo, and I wanted to destroy the white race, saying myself as Jewish. So, but this is the thing, is like, what confused me is he would seem kind of rational. So for instance, I asked him, so Grandpa, someone has HIV. Is that a punishment from God? My grandpa would be like, no, that's magical thinking. Again, to see a separate God. My grandpa would say, if you're not in the flow, then then you're more susceptible to getting sick. Yeah. But to blame it on a separate God, that's dualistic. There is no separate God. That's magical thinking. But then this is the thing that confused me is, so I'm thinking like, okay, so my grandpa would be like, yeah, but there's just, so I said, how do you explain it then? My grandpa would be like, well, there's just contamination in the world. There's viruses. And I don't know if Dr. Horace really believed that, but there's viruses and there is stuff like that, because there's contamination. That's just the way the world is. But, if you're in the flow, yeah, you'd be protected from it. But, there's contamination and stuff. So it seems like a rational explanation. And yeah, it's true, if you're not in the flow, then you might have sex with a dude and get HIV or whatever, but that it's not a punishment from God. That's just contamination. It's not punishment from God because he's gay. That's magical thinking. It's just there's contamination in the world, and it is true, if you're in the flow, then you're protected. The secret place is most high, the flow, and you won't get sick because everything is energy. But but there is contamination in the world. So it seems like it's very rational. So this put me back to my default of, okay, so you don't believe in a separate God, you don't believe in the supernatural. So okay, so I'll be a Darwinist in a Freudian. So like the other example with the Freud stuff was like, so my grandpa said, yeah, I asked him, do you think that Freud's right that religion is a delusion? And my grandpa's like, yeah, it is a delusion. But my grandpa would say is like, yeah, to believe in the separate gods and stuff, that's delusion. But, it can help, yeah, it helps maintain order, but it's a delusion. And I like that, because I was a Freudian Marxist and I wanted to destroy religion. But at the same time, though, my grandpa wasn't, he didn't seem to be, he wasn't a Marxist, though. My grandpa was not a Freudian Marxist, though. But he would say, like, yeah, if you're in the flow, you see, religious people, they become attached to beliefs. But my grandpa would say the Bible doesn't teach to be attached to beliefs. Like when it says believe in Jesus, that was, like even Dr. Horace said, whenever it says believe in the Bible, it doesn't mean believe, but it means understand in Greek. But my grandpa would be like, yeah, when it says believe in Jesus, that was a mistranslation, and probably, and I even heard from a different Bible scholar that it was believe into Jesus, which I thought was, okay, that's believe into the flow. Or, get into the flow. Believe until you can get into the flow. But, but my grandpa would say the Bible doesn't teach to believe anything, but the Bible does point to the flow, to transcending dualistic software, the illusion that you're a separate self, and to the flow, to inspiration and stuff like that. And that's what the stories and everything are pointing to. So, but again, so he's not really but so then my grandpa, so I was like, okay, well, okay, good. So you don't believe the Bible then? So then you don't believe the Bible. You must be a Marxist. That's what I was, a Marxist. And yeah, okay, so you don't. But my grandpa did believe the Bible, but he thought the Bible pointed to the transcendence of belief, to the flow, to inspiration, to the truth. So, but again, but because I didn't really understand what my grandpa meant, so when my grandpa's talking about the flow and transcending the ego, I'm thinking, okay, yeah, race mixing, the flow, it's a hippie thing. Let's just all race mix, but that's not the flow. That was still my ego, and I went back to my default, seeing myself as Jewish and wanting race mixing to destroy the white people. So that was not the flow. I did not transcend the self. I did not transcend the ego, but I thought I did. So I'm like, oh, and that's the one thing that my grandpa said, like hippies. My grandpa said a lot of hippies, they see things simplistically, and things are not simplistic. So, but this is the thing too. So my grandpa taught me, like, in terms of naming. So I was like, Adam names the animals. And the idea behind, my grandpa would say the negative part about naming, and maybe the reason why they don't name God in the Bible, is because when you name something, you label it, you categorize it, and you think you understand it. But my grandpa said, like, okay, you call someone schizophrenic, for instance. Okay, so then you named him. But you cannot see what he truly is. Now, my grandpa would probably say he's like energy event, or maybe he's an aspect of the quadrant model, or maybe he's consciousness, or whatever it is. But my grandpa say everything is one regardless. But you don't really see what he actually truly is, and you cannot really see. It's a simplicity. You've labeled him, and there's complexities to his character, and my grandpa would say, like, I remember one time he said that love is like, you see a baby with shit, but you don't see the shit. But like, there's something more complex than just saying, oh, that guy's a schizophrenic, and then you label him, and then you cannot see the complexities. Or, okay, or that's a bird, but you don't, it's not just a bird. But my grandpa would say, okay, transcend naming, okay? Like naming. Because, and also when you name something, you believe that there's separate things, I would guess, too. But there is no separate thing. Everything is one, right? And even Dr. Horowitz would say everything, there is no physical reality, right? But this is the thing, though. But I went back to my default, seeing myself as Jewish, and be like, okay, so yeah, gay and straight is a social construction. And yeah, I studied this history book that said that there were gay people back in the day, and they didn't call themselves gay. They didn't label themselves, but they did homosexual acts. And my grandpa would say, yeah, it is beneficial to not label yourself and like, because my grandpa said that people who are like Jewish and gay, they'll be like, I'm Jewish, I'm gay, and they make that their identity, but then they get attached to that identity, as opposed to, like, my grandpa did say, like, a rabbi said, yeah, it's important to, if you're Jewish, to say you're Jewish. But my grandpa would say, yeah, Jewish as in you transcend dualistic software to the flow. But but my grandpa would say people attach to their identities, like, oh, I'm gay, and they make that their whole lives, and that makes their identity. They're not in the flow because they see themselves as separate self. Not necessarily, but basically, though. But my point is, but I went back to my default, and I'm like, because my grandpa confused me. So I'm like, okay, so he's kind of anti-religious, it seems. So I was like, okay, well, I'm a Darwinist, and I'm a Freudian, and I want to see things through Freud and Darwin's lens. But my grandpa would say that those ways of viewing things is not existentially valid. And now I understand what he means, but at the time I didn't understand, because if you blame your genes, then you'll act instinctually. And, like, try to have a harem of women and stuff and say, oh, it's just my genes. And you justify it, as opposed to being in the flow where you see where one is consciousness, and you're not trying to be a good, you're not, it's transpersonal. And you're going to be able to, there's more discernment in your actions, and you take responsibility. You're more responsible. But so it's hard, a lot to explain, but so my grandpa's trying to tell me, like, oh, yeah, transcend naming and stuff, because my grandpa would say that there is no thing, and we are ising. I am Ryaning. I am not a thing. I am an event. I'm an energy event, and trying to get me to transcend the self, right? So, but I went back to my Jewish default, and I'm like, okay, yeah, there is no gay and straight, and there is no man and woman. Because my grandpa would say, yeah, if you're, Jesus says, in Christ there is no male nor female. And my grandpa would say, yeah, in the flow, you do not identify. My grandpa would say everything is energy, and you don't identify with the physical body. The physical body's illusion. There is no physical. My grandpa would say it's all energy. And, everything is 99% empty space. But, so I'm like, okay, yeah. There is no man and woman. There is no black or white. It's all social construction. But I thought that I had like transcendental consciousness, but really I had an agenda. I'm like, yeah, there is no gay and straight. So, there is no male or female, but really, and I started reading those books where like, oh yeah, the reason why women are not as good at men in math is because of the stereotype effect, and because their teachers grade them worse because it's a conservative bent by the teachers who want to maintain the status quo, and black and white, there is no the IQ is just a social construction, and there is no differences, and that's why I went back to like, there is no differences, we're it's all social constructions, and let's all mix. Because I saw myself as Jewish, and I wanted to really, ultimately, I just wanted to destroy the white race, and to be like, yeah, there is no man or woman, and the good is bad and the bad is good, and a woman, polyamory can be just as beneficial as, because as like monogamy, because a polyamorous person can get in the flow, and so can a monogamous, and the good is bad and the bad is good. And I went back to my Jewish default of wanting to race mix. I had an agenda, but I thought I was in the flow. And like, oh, there is no gay or straight, and there is no male or female. There is nothing. But I didn't really understand. I didn't truly understand what my grandpa was teaching. I was not in the flow. So, But so my grandpa's confusing me. So I'm like, is he religious? Because he seems like he's, he seems spiritual. And, he says like things are self-confirmatory. He seems kind of he says that sex is self-confirmatory. To me, that's like the ultimate. That seems like he's, okay, so he's a conservative because he's anti-promiscuity. But at the same time, I didn't quite get it. Because he's not necessarily, this is okay, so this is one thing that my grandpa taught. So like the Aztecs would sacrifice people, but apparently they would dress them up as idols, and then they would sacrifice them and then kill them and then eat them, throw them off the thing, and they would take their hearts out and stuff. But I asked my grandpa, okay, so is that satanic? Or can those people still go to heaven? Like, or are they in the flow? And my grandpa would be like, any ritual is the flow. So my grandpa would say, yeah, they can still get in the flow, even doing that ritual. So my grandpa would say it could have been a powerful ritual, because they dressed them up as idols and then killed them. Maybe that's a metaphor of transcending the illusion that there are separate selves. And maybe it did have a beneficial effect on the Aztecs who saw the people being sacrificed and stuff as idols. And it would represent the transcending the illusion of separate things into oneness in the flow. And any ritual, my grandpa would say, could help to people transcend the self, because any ritual is beneficial because it takes people out of their habits, their circumstances, their whims, their, and their relationships and whatever. And it takes them out of that so that they're not enslaved to that, and it can help people to facilitate the flow and the transcendence of the soul. So my grandpa would say, even that, those rituals that apparently Quetzalcoatl told them to do. Now Quetzalcoatl apparently is Satan. He's the morning star. But again, in my grandpa's worldview though, or in his teachings, according to his teachings, even a Satanist can get in the flow doing satanic rituals, because any ritual can be beneficial. At least it takes you outside of yourself, and you're not just a subject to your whims. So again, but I love this idea because I'm like, okay, the good is bad and the bad is good. Okay, yeah. So people who are in Satanists and orgies, they can get in the flow just as much. Yeah. Because I saw myself as Jewish, and I wanted to destroy religion. I wanted to destroy the structure of society, and I wanted the race mixing and the black people to just destroy the white people. But so I was not in the flow. I had an ego agenda. So again, so my grandpa's kind of confusing me. I'm like, but at the same time though, he would say like, okay, but yeah, I see things through the Darwinian or the Freudian perspective. Like I want to see things through the Darwinian. He would say that's existentially invalid. And Freud was for free sex, and same thing with like Wilhelm Reich and stuff. Now I asked my grandpa about Wilhelm Reich, and I asked him like, what do you think about his idea that everything is the sex energy? Now my grandpa thought that was probably dualistic software, and it probably was. He probably, seeing himself as Jewish, wanted to, like Freud, destroy the white race and destroy Christianity and promote promiscuity because he had an ego agenda. But at the same time, though, my grandpa said, but there is a higher aspiration in seeing everything as a sexual energy, because at least he's seeing everything as one. And that's the ultimate, is to see everything as one, that there is no thing. So even though he's saying that everything is the orgone or the sexual energy, there is a higher aspiration behind that. But again, we don't know what his intentions were, and they probably were centered around dualistic software. But at the same time, like, we don't know. Now, like, my grandpa was also a fan of Fritz Perls. And Fritz Perls would talk about, like, you know, transcending the self. He talked about, like Body Armor from Wilhelm Reich that he liked. I'm trying to remember. But Fritz Perls would talk about just like, yeah, just don't make excuses. It's kind of like a human potential thing, and just, you know, don't worry about the past and just be in the moment and just go all out. And that's what my grandpa was. So like, my grandpa liked the movie The Hurt Locker. In the movie The Hurt Locker, it's this guy and he's like going to war, and he would disarm bombs. And my grandpa, but he liked to be in war and he liked disarming bombs, and he couldn't go back to regular society. But my grandpa's like, that's good. You don't want to settle. My grandpa also liked the Great Gatsby book, where it says your reach should exceed your grasp, or what's a heaven for. So my grandpa says, you don't want to settle. Your reach should exceed your grasp. You don't want to be content, because that's self-confirmatory. You don't want to be lazy and just sitting around. You want to be constantly growing, constantly evolving. And like the Hurt Locker guy, he says my grandpa says you're either in disaster, discovery, or dullness. And the Hurt Locker guy, at least he's putting himself in disaster, which can aliven him. My grandpa say, increase his level of aliveness that can get you in the flow. And he's not sitting back and content. He's in the hero's journey. He's constantly growing. He's putting himself in dangerous situations. My grandpa told me, like, I remember when I was younger, he told me, like, this metaphor, like, you want to be on the precipice, like on the edge of the cliff. And he said some people will stand on a book on the edge of a cliff and they can't handle it, and they have to go off the edge because they need structure. They need to be stable. They need to feel safe. But my grandpa talks about, don't feel safe. You want to be constantly growing and constantly pushing the envelope and growing and expanding and never settling. My grandpa talked about, don't be in safety nets. And I think that's probably, you know, like Marxism's a lot about safety nets and letting people just like leech and be parasites and just self-confirmatory. And then, you know, like the 1984 Brave New World, like, let's just all watch porn and let's all have orgies, and that's all self-confirmatory. My grandpa be like, no, you don't no safety nets, no self-indulgence is self-confirmatory. But my grandpa be like, no, like Hurt Locker guy, he puts himself on the edge and he's disarming bombs and he's not settling. He needs to be, you know, on the edge and going all out and putting his life at risk. He can't settle. You know, and like Gatsby, my grandpa said Gatsby didn't want Daisy. Gatsby wanted the flow. And that's why Gatsby, like, it says something like, he wanted the green light, but it was always beyond his reach. But he says that's because people don't really want Daisy or the relationship. Relationship is illusion. It's based on the self and other. What people really want is a flow to transcend the self. And that's what the Hurt Locker guy wanted. He that level of aliveness would help him to transcend the self, to get in the flow, to break free of the self. So these are the kind of things that my grandpa was teaching. But again, I didn't quite understand. I was a Darwinist. I was still stuck in the ego, and I'm thinking, okay, yeah, my grandpa's telling me to be in the flow. So that's one thing. Like, my grandpa told me that, because I asked him, what do you think about the Black Lives Matter stuff? And my grandpa said, it is true that some police officers are express dualistic software. And, you know, and so there's a legitimate, you know, it's legitimate sometimes that people might be protesting against that. But then also, I asked, well, what do you think about black people, like Black Pride? And I was like, isn't that self-confirmatory? But my grandpa said, well, it's better than seeing themselves as inferior, because if you see yourself as superior, then you're more alive, and that could get you more in the flow. So I was like, but I love that idea. So I'm like, oh, but I was like, what about the white people seeing themselves as superior, or the Jews? And my grandpa was like, no, not really. If you're in the flow, you transcend the self. But at least for the black people, it's okay, because they've always seen themselves as inferior. So I was like, okay, good. Yeah, I want the black people to see themselves as superior, because that's what I wanted. I wanted to destroy the white race and make the black people superior. But again, so I didn't really quite understand it, and I was not in the flow. And I'm thinking, okay, the flow and transcending the ego. So it's the antithesis of white supremacy. And what that represents is that we should all race mix. Transcend dualistic software, that's race mixing. That's what I thought. But I didn't understand that, no, transcending dualistic software is transcending the illusion of self and other and pure awareness. But I wasn't in pure awareness. My Jewish ego was contaminating me to want race mixing and destroy the white race. But I didn't know that, because I didn't understand my grandpa's teachings. Talking about the flow and transcending the ego. I'm like, okay, that's race mixing. But I didn't understand. So I'm going to get to where I start to understand that in later lectures.